Salvete discipuli. I just thought I would do a recap of the notes on infinitives and indirect statements, purely because this is one of the most important grammatical constructions you'll likely encounter, extremely common in translations, and something that you'll have to keep at the forefront of your notes folder and always come back to. So first of all, you encounter the word infinitive. So when you think of the word infinitive, you think of the word to do something. However, over the course of the past couple of years, you've only encountered probably one type of infinitive. So that is this first one. So for example, to love. So you know those words to be like to love, amare. So generally, unless they're irregular, such as words such as esse, wele, male, nole, they're generally your re infinitives. Okay. But if you want to be very technical, because now you have a point of comparison, this is a present active infinitive. So to actively do the loving and to do it in the present, to do it now. So that's your stock standard one, the one you have been familiar with the longest. So if there's present active, there must be present passive. And you have actually already encountered these. And in the form of deponent verbs. So ones where you generally replace the letter E with a letter I. So for example, I try, the deponent verb is konari. So that is passive in form, but active in meaning. But you can also have passive infinitive forms for normal verbs, but they are going to be passive in form and passive in meaning. So if you do this to amo or amare, this would be amari, and it would mean to be loved. Now, to go to the footnote down the bottom very quickly, as we encountered in the deponent verbs notes last year, third and mixed conjugation. Now, if there are ones which have exceptions, it's always third and mixed. So here, you say, I'll just write down a temporary example. So say, for example, you have regere, to rule. And if you want to change it to be ruled, you'd replace the E with an I. However, as you've seen with deponent verbs, their principal parts, their second principal part, the to form, doesn't have the ER. So for example, to be ruled would be regi, just like, for example, to speak, deponent, is loqui, not loquery. So that's what that footnote means. So I'm going to skip down to the future because it's a little more digestible, easier to understand than the other one. So infinitives have tenses. So you have present infinitives, but you also have future. So as you can see now, I'll put this in gray because this is extremely rare. And in the years I've been teaching Latin, I think I've seen this about once in a scene translation. So I don't think any attention given to it whatsoever in the Oxford Latin course. So if on a very rare occasion you want to say to be about to be verbed, it would be the supine, which is the actual fourth principal part. So not the PPP, the actual neuter singular looking fourth PP, and iri. So that's that. Let's go to the more common future active. So if there's a future passive, just like if there's a present active, present passive, there has to be a future active as well. So this would be not to be about to be loved, but actively in the future to be about to love. And this one is literal. So the word to be and the word about to verb, which is the future active participle. So in the case of loving, it is going to be esse. And the first word is going to be the fourth PP plus UR before the declinable ending. So amat urus esse, literally to be, about to love. Now, there is only one tense left. So if there are present infinitives, active, passive, future infinitives, active, passive, there has to be a past tense one as well. So the fancy word for past is perfect. So there's a perfect active infinitive and a perfect passive infinitive. The way they translate in English is to have loved. So obviously to have loved in the past. And passive, the only difference is to have been loved. And in terms of their Latin formation, these ones are a little bit trickier. So I'll start with the passive one actually first. That one's probably a little easier to understand. But the way I always remembered it, it's the fourth principal part plus essay. So this one, like the future active, is 2 words as well. But the only difference is rather than the future active participle, the fourth PP, it's the fourth PP or the perfect passive participle. So you would have here amatus esse. So if you think about it, literally, it's to be having been loved, which if you think about it can translate, if you tinker with it a bit, to have been loved. And as we have seen before with other things, the only difference between the active and the passive form is the active is 1 word involving the third PP, and the passive looks similar, but it's 2 words and the third PP turns to the fourth PP. So this here is no exception. So if you want to say to have loved, ama we say. To have been, fui say. To have ruled, rexi say. So if you think about it, again, this is kind of like saying amawi esse. So to be, I have loved. If you tinker with it again, to have loved. Now I'll come back to this right-hand column before we finish. But to scroll down, these double bullet points below. Now this relates to the infinitives, which are 2 words. So the first word of those 2 words is a participle, whether it be a PPP for the perfect passive or a future active participle for the future active infinitive. So being a participle, being an us, adjective, obviously the first word must agree with the noun and any accompanying adjective. So that's a changeable ending. It could be amaturum esse, could be to amatura, amaturi, amaturai, etc. So different endings depending on what noun is about to do the loving or what noun has been loved. So knowing these types of infinitives, the different types of infinitives now, is very important for the third and last type of indirect speech, and that is indirect statements. So just to scroll down. So you've encountered 2 types of indirect speech. So in layman's terms, that is when you have a speech bubble, and rather than you take away the quotes and you describe what it says in the speech bubble. So before we have had indirect, IC stands for indirect commands. So you can have a command like do your work, but then you change it to a description. The teacher asks the student to do his work, or literally the teacher asks the student so that he may do his work. Then you can also describe questions. What are you doing? The man asked the woman what she was doing. So now we're just going to do the same, except not with direct commands or direct questions, but just with normal sentences, direct statements. And so if you want to say a statement like I am a good boy, and in a speech bubble, when you want to describe it, the student said that he was a good boy. That'd be the indirect statement. So the great thing about indirect statements, unlike indirect commands, indirect questions, is that it doesn't involve the subjunctive. There are elements or similarities you will see with the other 2 types of indirect speech, but you don't have to worry about sequence of tense and all that. So first things first, like indirect questions, you have to think about what tense the direct quote is. And going back to our last page, that will influence the tense of the infinitive that you use. So obviously, if something is in the present tense, I am a good boy. When you make it indirect, it's going to be a present infinitive. If you say, I have gone to many countries before, you're going to use a perfect infinitive. If you're going to say, I will go to school tomorrow, you're going to use a future infinitive. So just to give examples for each time frame. So present, direct speech. If you want to say Marcus scarcely helps, so most indirect speech is introduced by words such as he says or said. So you would say, for example, he says that Marcus scarcely helps. Or if you say he said, you would say he said technically that Marcus scarcely helped. So says that he helps, said that he helped. So there's an element of sequence of tense. So we've seen that before, says that he helped, said that he helped. But the great thing is that there's not two different subjunctives. So the word for helps or helped is just the infinitive. So if you think about it, technically you are saying he says or said, Marcus to help scarcely. Now that sounds very awkward. So more naturally, the way you translate the accusative, because these are commonly called accusative infinitive constructions, because they're the two features of them. The way you translate the accusative is that the noun, and then the infinitive just turns into verbs or verbed in this case. So very similar to what would be in an indirect question, the present and imperfect subjunctive. But as I said, the great thing about indirect statements is you just use an infinitive. You don't need to know about subjunctives or sequence of tense. A sentence which is in the past, and just for variety, I've made it into a passive sentence. So Marcus has scarcely been helped. So indirect. He says or said that Marcus has or had scarcely been helped. So with this one, again, says that he has. So that would kind of be like primary sequence. Said that he had. That would kind of be like secondary sequence. But to reiterate what I've been saying, you don't need any subjunctives. They are just infinitives for that verb. So again, dicit or dixit, that Marcus, accusative, Marcum, scarcely is Wix again. And now we have a perfect passive infinitive. So that's the PPP plus SA. So you were, you ware, irregular, you, we, utum, utum, SA. And the reason why I have highlighted the endings is because as was with the double dot point here, double bullet point, the participle has to agree. So if it's Marcum, utum. If I said the girl has scarcely been helped, pualam, utam. If I said the boys have scarcely been helped, pueros, utos. So just like any other adjective, being a participle has to agree with the noun it describes in number, gender, and case. So this is no exception. And the future, Marcus will help us. So if you want to describe that quote, you'd say, he says or said that Marcus will / would help us. So he says that he will, said that he would. So again, Marcus, that Marcus is the accusative, Marcum. Just to complete the sentence, us is nos. And now we have a future active infinitive. So that's a future active participle. So not utum, but ut, urum, and esse. So just to backtrack, this past tense one is literally, he says or said, Marcus to have been helped scarcely. Again, sounds a bit awkward, so you just loosely say he says that Marcus. And this one, if you look at it literally, he says Marcus object to be about to help us. You can say that, but it just doesn't sound natural. So you just say, he says that Marcus will, he said that Marcus would help us. So with the infinitives, when you translate them, so this last column is very important because that's how you more commonly translate these. So you generally don't translate them as to do something or something to be done. So present active, generally you just say in an indirect statement. So this is when you convert a direct statement into indirect. So when it's present tense and you convert it, it's either is, was loving, or just loves or loved. And this is still present tense, but it's passive. So is or was being loved. Perfect is has or had loved, and passive is still has or had, but has or had been loved. And future is will or would love. So when you are converting a sentence which is in the future tense, such as Marcus will help us. So some of these things I will have mentioned, but in your formal notes, so which you should get down, otherwise you're relying on your memory, and if it's anything like mine, you'll forget. Like indirect questions, the tense of the direct speech influences the verb form and or the tense used. So as I was saying, if you are converting a sentence which is in the present tense, Marcus scarcely helps, as in right now. So see how I used a present infinitive. But when I had a sentence which was in the past, Marcus has scarcely been helped, or you could even say Marcus has scarcely helped in the past, there was a perfect infinitive. And then Marcus will help us in the future. So see how this one here is a future active infinitive, uturum esse. But, so I probably would have mentioned this already, but just to reiterate, unlike indirect questions or indirect commands, there's an element of sequence of tense, but there's no sequence of tense. The sequence of tense rules don't apply because there are no subjunctives. You just use an infinitive. So you don't worry about what the tense of the main verb is, etc., etc. It's the verb that is going to be second is going to be an infinitive. It's not going to, don't worry about present imperfect subjunctive and all that. And when you have a pronoun, so just to go over the key mini words, if you are saying, for example, that I, that you, that he, that we, etc. So if you have a may, it's that I. So he says that I am good. If you have a te, he says that you are good. So you should see where I'm getting at here. If you say, it is he says that he, she, it, or they say that they themselves. So whoever's doing the saying is speaking about themselves. Nos, he says that we are good, for example. So the word for, usually the word for we or us. Wos, he says that you plural. And the last, the last two, aum and am. So he or she, but not the speaker. So this first one is A says that A, whereas this one would be, if it's a two men, A says that B. So the great thing about Latin, in English, if I say, Chris says that John has a, Chris tells John that he has a problem. You cannot tell who has the problem. So whether Chris is saying to John, I have a problem, or whether Chris is saying to John, you have a problem. But in Latin, you can tell. So if Chris is saying, I have a problem, so Chris says that he himself has a problem, you say. If it is Chris says to John, you have a problem, so Chris tells John that he, that is John, has a problem, it's someone else. So it's aum. And lastly, Eos and Eas. So for example, he says that they. So the same thing can happen if you say they say that they are good. So if A says that A are good, it's say. But if it's a group of A says that a group of B are good, it would be Eos. So yeah, again, that same thing I said about Chris and John, you can do the same for plural form. So yeah, they say that they themselves are good, or they say that they, someone else, are good. So for anyone who misses these notes, or if anyone just needs a recap just to hear it again, this is for you, just as a resource to help you out. So I will leave it at that.